You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Girl, you have got to try this Laneige lip mask. Trust me, my lips needed that love. Love these vanilla vibes from Kayali. That top note is just so smooth.
Smooth and stunning. That's what you get with this K18 hair mask.
Those brands everybody's talking about, they're at Sephora. Discover the hype with the hottest names in beauty, including Laneige, Kayali, K18, and Rare Beauty. Only at Sephora.
This episode is brought to you by Intuit TurboTax. Didn't file with TurboTax last year? That's in the past. Now, Taxes is getting the TurboTax app and filing your own taxes for free if you didn't file with them last year. File by February 18th. All tax forms, all 100% free. Now, this is Taxes. Intuit TurboTax. New filers and filers who didn't use TurboTax last year only must start and file your own taxes in-app by February 18th. Excludes TurboTax Live. Full terms at TurboTax.com.
Every night, the sky would glow orange. I'm not sure it was good environmentally, but when the mills were booming, they lit up the sky. So said a native of Youngstown, Ohio, Pat Ungaro, who worked in the steel mills in the 1970s. And I always had a job in the summer, making big money in the mill or one of the other industries related to it. Quit one job and take another. I made enough money in the summer to pay for my school. That's almost a fantasy world today. He was a city councilman representing the north side of the town and a principal at the South High School in Youngstown, and he'd go on to be mayor of the town. And he was there for an incident that occurs in 1977. Another worker who began working at Sheet and Tube in Youngstown said, "The overwhelming sights. I didn't know what I was walking into. Cranes going overhead, flames, heat. It was a scary thing for a while. Eventually, you just grow into it." One worker told his story, "My wife and I moved here with $23 in our pocket. No checking account, no credit cards, no rich uncle, nothing. We moved into the apartments and I said, I can't pay till I get a paycheck. And the management at the apartment said, will you work at Sheet and Tube? Yes. Then you're good for it." One union representative said sometime around August in 1977, all of a sudden the union representatives from the 5 local unions that represented the workers had a lunch meeting. They were buying us lunch, and that didn't happen very often. I knew something was up. They took us into the superintendent's lunchroom in the back. We didn't even know what it looked like. And the district manager said, "We're just bringing you in to reassure you that everything's going to be all right. All these rumors that you're hearing on the shop floor." We left the meeting and said, if they're telling us all right, we've got to be in big trouble. They would turn out to be right in their hunches. Like every fall morning, the workers, armed with lunch pails and hard hats, appeared at the plant. The only worry on their minds was the upcoming Pittsburgh Steelers game on Monday Night Football. And they told us, you're done. No 2-week notice, no warning. They just came and said goodbye. Per the New York Times, today the huge mill was operating much as it had since 1900, white steam and red dust rising towards gray clouds, the smell of burning coal making the nose wrinkle, the blast of horns from locomotives punctuating the industrial bustle. A local crane operator told the Times, "It's going down at the end of this week, and they'll never light it back up again." We knew within the hour, said a worker at a different plant, that the guys down the river were hurting. We knew within a day the families were hurting, and we knew within a week the whole region was in trouble. A neighbor came over to him. The neighbor worked on the locomotive. And he said, I think you just lost your job. I heard that they're going to close the Campbell Works. And I told him, you're an engineer on the railroad. If I lose my job, you're going to lose your job too. All the iron ore that carry the coal and the coke, that's no more. We're not going to need trains in Youngstown. A year later, both of us, indeed, were out of work. Stephen Garrow, the principal and former steel worker, said the school was affected. We had 2,000 kids at South High School, and people started leaving the town right away. Our enrollment dwindled. Most people, when they used up their benefits, left the area. See the kids all saying goodbye? That was depressing. U.S. Steel, McDonald Works, also closed in the early 80s. Hundreds of workers laid off. Republic Steel was closed in the 1970s. Not only was the Campbell Works at Youngstown Sheet and Tube closed, but so was the Briar Hill Works, their other plants. While the Black Monday, September 1977, affected about 5,000 workers, overall, 50,000 workers would be unemployed in Youngstown, and the population would be cut in half. Said the wife of a steel worker interviewed in the newspaper, this was one of the largest steel plants in the country. And this is the Youngstown Sheet and Tube was in that Supreme Court case where Truman tried to take the steel mills. If a job in Mahoning Valley is not safe, the woman said, then no job is safe. And indeed, that's what workers would feel in the late 70s, the early 80s. The mills were fed by open hearth furnaces. We knew this was old technology. We knew it could take 8 hours to make heat. The newer ones were called basic oxygen furnaces. They could produce the same material even better in about an hour and a half. And these furnaces were new technology. Germany and Japan were rebuilt after the war, and that's what they started with. So by the 1970s, it got to where you could ship steel, even with the cost of transporting it. I remember coming home with the office Christmas tree, said one of the workers at the mill. I was the youngest, and the boss said, you take it home. My wife looked at me with this Christmas tree in my hand, and I said, Merry Christmas, sweetheart. I've been fired. No one knows quite what to do. Within a few days, there's a council that's developed of union workers, steel workers, local clergymen, local residents not working for the mill. Petition gets signatures to try to keep the plant open. And 300 men in 5 buses go to Washington, D.C. to plead their case. A man was protesting alone at the Pentagon. This was 1965, and it was a little early for that sort of activity, a lot early for that sort of activity. And Stoughton Lynn, who had already been part of student protest, of civil rights protest, had been in Freedom Summer in Mississippi, he saw him, and he decided to join up with them. And then those now 2 men went daily to the Pentagon to protest involvement in Vietnam. But in 65, this kind of thing just wasn't common. Military police surrounded the 2 men. The hell do you 2 think you're doing? And when they asked, Stoughton Lind responded, you don't understand. We're the first of thousands. He was right. Stoughton Lind had already been an activist. He was forced into activism during the Korean War in a way. He was drafted into the army because he was a conscientious objector. He didn't serve, was given a non-combat job. The Army went through files and in some cases targeted these people. They found that he had communist affiliations in college. As Lynn described, he was dabbling, attending a few club meetings in a university. He wasn't really a communist. The Army also contended that his mother was a modern professional woman, in quotes. And for these 2 reasons, he was given a dishonorable discharge. Till he sued and he and others forced the Army to make their discharges honorable. Indeed, this was a man who had worked along those 3 civil rights workers that were slain in 1963 in Mississippi. He knew them. Stoughton just passed away recently. You would describe him as a left-wing activist. He might be called a hippie. But in the 70s and 80s, Stoughton Lynn turned from the Vietnam War protest to another issue, one that has resonance today and might be surprising because it's not so clearly identified in the same boxes. And I'm talking about a movement to stop plant closures, to encourage companies to keep manufacturing jobs open, or as some have called it, resisting rust. In fact, up until his recent death, he had advocated people to not have rust, to keep machines running, to do everything they could to keep plants open. We'll have another fellow that we'll discuss, Eric Mann, who also is a left-wing activist, still a podcaster, still an activist involved in the civil rights movement, and also turns to organizing workers and telling communities they could do something about plant closures. And Eric Mann is one of these people who's on Influence Watch's list. This is a right-wing site that looks at left-wing activists who are having influence. They've got him on their list. And yet, in the 70s and 80s, his political issue, seen as radical at the time, would be welcome in a GOP convention today. Keeping manufacturing jobs, keeping plants open, keeping companies making products here. At that time, the idea that something like that wouldn't be a simple free market decision was subject to question. I'm not saying that everyone was a libertarian back in 77, and certainly when the Youngstown event happens, you'll see even Republican Governor James Rhodes try to appeal President Carter to see if there's anything the federal government can do about keeping this plant open. Job losses have a way of making interventionists out of all of us, right? Walter Mondale proposes having a Buy America program in the 1984 Democratic platform. More moderate Democrats, including Gary Hart, Leon Panetta, so-called Atari Democrats, free traders, will stop that plank from happening. Hart doesn't get the nomination in 84, but still has influence because of the number of delegates he has. You wouldn't see a plank like that today. Both parties generally embraced free trade. Indeed, Stoughton Lynn's going to get a group of people together in Youngstown and coalescing around a clergyman and calling themselves the Ecumenical Coalition with labor union activists, teachers, other people. They're all affected by these job losses. They'll go to the White House to present their petition. It is the Carter White House. At the time they arrive, right after the plant closing, like 5 days later, the White House does not accept that petition, unaware of whether Carter was part of that decision or not. He doesn't even have an aide accept it. The only thing that he will propose later on is a total revamping of the steel industry. It doesn't make it into congressional legislation in a sufficient fashion. Reagan administration also would reject a bailout of the steel industry. However, as we'll discuss later, legislation will be passed during his presidency without his signature that would be the type of legislation that someone like a Stoughton Lynn and these steelworkers would seek. I wouldn't be a good historian if I just told the story of the industrial age in America from, say, after the Civil War and then everything closing in the 1970s. I think about the early bog iron furnaces that you would have seen in Virginia, in Massachusetts, in New Jersey, and what's now the Pine Barrens. It's only a Pine Barrens as of fairly recent times because the forest has overgrown what was a colonial and early American industrial scape. In fact, a lot of the trees in what's now the Pine Barrens would have been chopped down to create bog iron. We talked about that in an earlier episode, the bog iron industry in the Pine Barrens in New Jersey And John McPhee's great book on the Pine Barrens, is a source for that. There were also furnaces in Virginia. There's one that's been restored. There's examples of them in Massachusetts and Maryland. Yeah, there were about 35 furnaces in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey from the time a little bit before the Revolution and pretty much finished by the time of the Civil War, when it just became inefficient to create iron. The time that it required to create it from mineral deposits as you get in the bogs, heated up in stone furnaces. And the woods and nature filled up the space. And so you still might see these ruins of flat-top pyramid iron furnace structures made from Jersey stone, sometimes brick or other rock, 20 feet high or so, 20-foot square base, arches on all four sides, insulated from the exterior walls by brick, sand, and mortar. Between March of the year until the winter freeze, you'd have people working 12-hour shifts, keeping these furnaces going. Some of these old furnaces have not even been discovered. There's locals who think they know where they are and precise locations aren't there, and some of the remnants of them are completely gone. But at one time you had 35 forging operations in the pines of New Jersey, not far from Philadelphia. So even the industrial blight that you're seeing now is something that you will see before. Somewhere those workers, certainly, because they were displaced, and what's left in the Pine Barrens is a very limited type of agricultural, like sorghum farming and things like that, some timber industry, some hunting, and some people just sort of living off the land, which is at the time that McPhee writes his book in 1969. There's still plenty of that going on. And people are called pineys, and it's a derogatory term, but they take it as a badge of honor in some cases. And you would not know that at one time this is in the industrial area of New Jersey. I'm sure at that time there were politics, there were complaints, there were, say, protests, and all of this as industry moved to Pennsylvania, where coal country was, where you could much more easily burn coal and produce steel. It's all reminiscent of a time that I was in Burlington, Iowa, not far from the Mississippi River. You can hear the boats. It's clear as day to me as I remember it. And for the details that I don't remember, I had a journal that I can refer to. It was just in 2023. I can remember walking along the train tracks and reaching a point where I'm south of the small downtown area. And you're just surrounded by these large, deep red brick buildings, 6 to 10 stories high, former factories, former warehouses. None of them are occupied now. One that gets my attention has this turret tower at the top with boarded up arch windows along both of its sides, and I think it was once the largest produce distributor in the Midwest. Another has a broken grain chute. And still another, I'm pretty sure, is Schramm and Schmeg's old wholesale dry goods store. A dry goods store would sell fabrics and threads and needles and clothing, some finished goods. Schramm came from Bavaria, Germany, and moved to Burlington in the early days of the city. They occupied 3 floors in the basement of this building, and they employed 5 men. I see the Iowa Biscuit Company, constructed in 1914. Somewhere here, a little bit farther away, was the old Murray Iron Works that employed thousands of Irish American immigrants at the same time and was still making machines the last decade. I take steps carefully here, walking along the railroad like a hobo might. I have to be careful because it's still a live railroad. Indeed, the same Amtrak train that I come into town on goes through here each day. The railroad is Burlington. Burlington gave its name to the Burlington and Missouri, the B&M, the largest railroad in the area, in 1852. Burlington was a railroad hub, and the B&M had the postal contract to bring mail from Chicago to all of Iowa and the area for over 80 years. It innovated in rail from new brakes to new types of cars. Cars were made here. Railroad products were made here. When the automobile arrived in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, it started to dominate. Burlington had to compete and innovated again. The B&M Railroad created the smooth, new Zephyr train. It looked like a speeding bullet, with very smooth edges, Art Deco look. That Zephyr still runs through here, part of Amtrak since 1971, and goes all the way through Iowa and on to California. I talk to people here who have taken the train just for the heck of it to go to California. It's 3 or 4 days. You come back. Commerce has beginnings. We've talked about those in the Ark of Commerce. But commerce also has ends, and that's what we'll discuss in this episode. It's a very important topic, one that's been part of discussions for decades since the tail end of the 20th century. The end of commerce. Rusting of factories as America transitions from mostly manufacturing to mostly service. This topic keeps coming up. We use that term, and you can use that term for a place like Burlington, even though locals probably wouldn't like it very much. The Rust Belt. Can't help but feel it today as I walk through this area. I'm the only one. I'm completely alone. It's a National Historic Site. It's an Iowa State Historic Site. They have a listing of every business that these buildings used to be. There's a couple of them that are being converted into apartments. In a few moments, I'll go to a food festival. I'll buy honey from Illinois bee makers, have a local brew. People will try to help me with my family ancestry. What did you say your name was? Carlson. A lot of Carlsons here. I've already done the research, but it's nice to have the help anyway. I'll go to Burlington's Snake Alley, which is the most crookedest street in the world. It even beats Lombard Street in San Francisco. The turns and curves on this road constructed of these little rectangular bricks. It was made in the 1890s to make it the feel of Snake Alley as you walk down, and you can either go in a car or walk down. If you're walking, you have to look all around to be sure there's no cars coming down, because it's pretty steep. It gives you the feel of being in like a French vineyard. And it's such an important street because it brought people from the river where the factories were up to the bluff where the Victorian homes were. It was made in the time of coaches and carriages. I'll walk past the former Chittenden and Eastman Company, a leading U.S. mattress manufacturer. I'll think about my grandmother, who graduated from high school here in 1940 and worked a side job in the cookie factory. The Depression wasn't quite over at that time. It hit Burlington hard. It hit all cities hard. It hit the Rust Belt hard. It hit anybody who made products, manufacturing factories, hit them particularly hard. She'd leave the town, and the same year she graduated high school, go with her husband who had a job at a steel plant in New Jersey, lend-lease work. And as I walk up the sidewalk in this town, which recently got paved, lovely sidewalks, I see the new Capitol Theater recently restored. They have movies and events there. And the princely Hotel Burlington, which towers over the city. The sign, Hotel Burlington, towers over the city. It was once a marble palace of a hotel for traveling business people buying Burlington's goods. 200 rooms, 5 dining rooms, and an exclusive club known as the Flint Hills Club. And it operated in some fashion all the way to 1982. It took a hit in the 50s with the automobile, tried to even open a separate Burlington motel till the early 80s. The hotel sat vacant for many years and now is an apartment building. Well, there's nothing unique in this town that I'm talking about, Burlington, Iowa. It has all the problems of any Rust Belt. It lost its big factories in the 1970s and 1980s, and some of them had already slowed by then. Most notably the Champion Spark Plug plant in the 1970s, the Iowa Army ammunition plant in 1974 that moves to Texas, the Murray Iron Works we talked before, converted to a machine shop, making Corliss steam engines and others. It was incorporated into Siemens manufacturing, and it reduced operations in the 1970s and would finally close in 2018. The Caterpillar tractor factory closes in 1984. Huge event. In the region, in the area, the John Deere factory, which employed people here and in other towns, lays off workers. Many farms lose business in Iowa at the same time, in the mid-'80s. 30 banks in Iowa close. Even as late as 2015, a company called PGW, which employed about 29 people in manufacturing jobs, were told that the Burlington plant would cease operations. The population of Burlington, Iowa, in 2024 was about the same as it was in 1890. About 23,000 people. There are perhaps 200 more people living here now than in 1890. The town, with expected industrial growth, really should be up to 100 or 200, 300,000 people by now. They were hit because the industry they chose was manufacturing. Even in 2018, as we mentioned, 125 people lost their jobs at the Siemens plant. Company based in Germany closed their doors. It won't be a very Merry Christmas for a lot of the people in Burlington, said Robert Morrison, who was a Siemens employee in the town. It hurts. It hurts. Part of my life has gone away. But that's part of life. Nothing's changed. He worked at the Siemens plant for over 30 years, a member of the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, Local 1010. Donald Trump had appeared in Burlington, Iowa in 2015 as his campaign was gearing up. He declared, "I will be the greatest jobs president that God ever created. I will bring jobs back," said Morrison in an article in the Guardian newspaper. "If you invoke the Almighty, you'd better deliver."
What do I care what kind of clothes I wear just to fix the plumbing? Besides, these remind me of the days when I was a gay young blade.
William Frawley, the actor who played Fred Mertz on the TV show I Love Lucy, came from Burlington, Iowa.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. During tax season, your personal info travels to a lot of places, between payroll, your tax consultant, and the IRS. If your W-2 gets exposed, that's just the ticket for identity thieves. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it guaranteed or your money back. Don't let identity thieves take you for a ride. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
While strolling through the park one day, in the very, very month of May, I was taken by surprise.
His mother was devoutly religious, did not want him acting. He took a series of railroad jobs, but always on the side, he would disobey his mother's wishes and do some theater work. He acted in Denver, he acted in St. Louis, acted in Chicago a bit. Tried to get his brother to do a vaudeville act, but his mother told his brother to come back home when she found out. and sells a script based on his vaudeville acting for $500 and says, I can really do this. Goes out to L.A., starts acting in movies. And it's when he's 64 that he has his overnight success. It becomes the cantankerous landlord in I Love Lucy. Another celebrity in Burlington, Iowa was Kurt Warner, the quarterback of the Rams, who took the team to the Super Bowl. Remember him? And Aldo Leopold. On January 11th, 1887, the famed American naturalist, writer, ecologist. I mean, if you're in the environmental movement, you've studied the history of it all, you know Aldo Leopold. He's born in Burlington, Iowa. And of course, there's the Indian chief Black Hawk. Talked about him before. Forced here by relocation of his land in Illinois. And he used this area right around Burlington for his war council to plan to get his home back. His picture remains here at the Des Moines County Courthouse, etched into the building. I'm here trampling through the town by foot. I came by train. There's no Uber or car company here. You hit Uber on the app in this town and you'll get no cars. Only place that's happened to me ever. I'll walk up and see the ancestral home of my great-grandfather, George Benjamin Carlson, a nice big yellow house, lawn, and remember hearing family stories about riding in the car from Jersey to Iowa, long trips, and realizing this is the house they were going to. And then I'll trample over, not so far away, to the smaller house where Orrin Statz, my other paternal great-grandfather, had a much smaller house, worker housing, close together. They say Burlington's back. There's new shops and restaurants, and for the first time in a long time, cruise ships come here. And there was a cruise ship arriving the day after I was leaving. When they do arrive, a local jazz band of Burlingtonites comes and plays for them. And they eat at the Drake, which is a restaurant converted from a giant hardware store. Even when I was there in 2023, or when I look at articles in the past about various plant closings that happened at Burlington, you always see, well, we still have the Case construction plant, a key employer in the city. In early 2000, it even picks up production and hires more people. Well, recently I see that CNH, the company that owns Case, which produces backhoes, tractor loaders. The tractor backhoe was invented here in Burlington, Iowa. Will eliminate about 350 jobs, part of a continuous global initiative to streamline operations. Burlington Mayor John Billups described the news as a gut punch to the entire community. The town has come back in a sense. It's one of the key areas to go to restaurants and retail shopping in this part of the state. It has Snake Alley, which is a local landmark, a kind of Midwest Lombard street. These really tiny rectangle bricks. A very crooked street. It actually wins Guinness Book of World Records for the most crooked street in the world. I went there a few times, this Snake Alley, during the trip. Actually, I went there so many times that even just being in town a few days, I became a mini tour guide. People would say, "Is this Snake Alley?" Yes, it is. Not much to it. New fancy Capitol Theater that has been restored, and a swanky restaurant called Martini's on the 5th floor of the old Mercy Hospital building, which is now a condominium. There, you can order a steak and look over with a stunning 270-degree view of the city and the river and the bridge that goes across between Iowa and Illinois. When I look at that bridge, it's no modern bridge, one of these bridges with the kind of suspension cables, more modern looking bridge. It's built in the 90s. The one before that, my great-grandfather Warren stats had helped to work on. So I think about that as I look at it. Is there something about capitalism that's just natural, that there's going to be the cycles that we call boom and bust, fall and rise? Sometimes the economy's good, and sometimes it's simply not. Bust phases, when supply is big and lowers prices, so there isn't enough demand. Or booms. Investors start buying things again. Boom and bust cycles can last for a long time. There's no predicting their length. We have not been experienced something like what they did in Japan, which is a recession that's lasted like 2 decades. We've experienced many panics in our history. 1819, 1873, 1882, 1907, 1893. What can we make of it? Right? Is there just something about capitalism that's natural? There's just going to be these cycles that we call boom and bust, fall and rise. Sometimes the economy's good, sometimes it's bad. Sometimes people feel like pulling money out of their pocket and investing it, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they want the stock market. Sometimes they want gold. Sometimes supply is big and price is lower, and there's not enough demand. Other times, prices are high. Investors start buying things again. Boom and bust cycles can last for a long time. There are big ones. There's that 1873 panic. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The 1893 panic that occurs really as Harrison's going out and Grover Cleveland's coming in. Of course, the Depression. But you even have a depression before that, a smaller one. Post-World War I. I read here from a businessman named A.B. Farquhar, based in York, Pennsylvania. And he got my attention for this reason. He was a friend and campaign manager for Grover Cleveland, and Cleveland writes him a bunch of letters. And so as researching about the second attempt for Grover Cleveland to be reelected in 1892, Farquhar is one of those friends that supports financially and encourages Cleveland to run and other people to support him. But Farquhar has this really interesting life where he's on the battlefield of Gettysburg, and he lives all the way into the 20s. He lives long enough to be, sadly, hit by an automobile. So you're like at Gettysburg, you end up meeting Abraham Lincoln, which he does at one point. You meet a lot of presidents, including Grover Cleveland, personal friend, and you'll meet even Teddy Roosevelt. And you get hit by a car. He doesn't die immediately, but didn't help his life and dies in 1925. Amazing life. And of course, that's how I do things sometimes. I'm starting, okay, let me see if he has a book. And of course he has a book. But Farquhar talks about what it's like to be in a panic. And admittedly, he's not talking about a worker's point of view. He owns a large farm equipment company in York, Pennsylvania. For a small businessman, he's reached the point at which the next level would be you could call him a titan. A few minutes before noon on September 18th, 1873, the message came over the wire to York, Pennsylvania. J. Cook and Company have been suspended. And so he says, you have to understand this, he says. Only those who were in business then could have an idea of what that news meant to us in York and every citizen of the nation. J. Cook? The man who financed the Civil War. He was the foremost financier in the country. The people in general who knew nothing of finance, he was the financial father. That firm could fail? It was unthinkable. As the Philadelphia Inquirer put it, no one could have been more surprised if snow had fallen amid the sunshine of a summer moon. A policeman arrests a newsboy in Philadelphia for crying all about J. Cook's failure. The policeman could not imagine the fact of the failure and thought the boy was gone mad. The 18th fell on a Thursday. By Friday morning, nearly everybody with a bank account was outside his bank's doors foaming at the mouth for his deposit. No one thought of doing business York was more excited than when the Confederate Army was approaching. Every bank in town was in the midst of a run. The same condition extended all over the whole country. By Saturday, nearly all the banks, the private bankers, and the New York Stock Exchange had closed. President Grant was in New York trying to find some way to stop the panic. The farmers who had entrusted their money to P.A.S. Small stormed the hardware shop to get back what had been given to them. No man wanted to listen to reason. The bottom had fallen. Personally, I was not frightened. It has never been my habit to let my emotions run away with my sense. So I just closed the shop and walked about to see what was going on. I went in on Philip and Samuel Small's store to see how they were making out. I found them calm and careful as ever, ready to meet customers. Their bearing was in no way different than usual, and the crowd of excited farmers and townspeople jammed into every inch of the open space and extended out into the street. They were ready. Back of them ranged neat piles of gold and greenbacks, and still further back in the shadow lay a great open sack, out of the mouth of which overflowed onto the counter that looked like a stream of gold coins that they evidently had not had time to stack. They were not seeking any excuses or promising to pay tomorrow or any other day. They were ready to pay everyone. So you got to remember, at this time, a hardware shop might also be a form of a bank. You would keep money on account there. So they said this to everyone. We are very glad to give you back your money, but you must understand that you are never to come in this store again to ask us to care for your money. To be ostracized by Small's hardware store meant something. To many, it meant more than gold. And gold was there for the asking. So two streams of people shoved their way back through the crowd. The one with money in hand, the other, satisfied that their money was safe, leaving. In a couple of hours, the crowd was satisfied. And when the store cleared, the Smalls started gathering their money to put it into the safe. And as they swept the overflow back into the great bag, one of them, with a half smile, tossed a coin to me. Keep that as a remembrance, he said. It was a bright, bright penny. The moment they had heard of the failure the day before, Philip Small had gone to Philadelphia Mint and drawn newly minted stock of big copper pennies. The real gold they had piled up in plain sight. The copper gold had lurked more discreetly in the shadow. Samuel and Philip Small had stood out there as bravely and unconcerned as though every copper penny had been a gold eagle. This panic of 1873 was preventable. A severe depression following a period of overexpansion was inevitable. But the panic itself had no reason for being, and would not have taken place had it not been for nervousness on the part of J. Cook's New York partners, who closed the New York branch office, the main office being in Philadelphia, wholly on their own initiative. The Southern Pacific Railways were reaching out, and J. Cook had become heavily involved, and was practically carrying the Northern Pacific Railroad. Members of Congress speculated freely, and subsequent investigations disclosed that a very large number of rather eminent politicians had a speculative bond and stock account carried for them by bankers without putting up a penny. A skilled financier could have known that condition was dangerous, but we, in York, Pennsylvania, knew little of finance, and neither did people throughout the country. The Christmas of 1873 was about as cheerless a festival as has ever been intoned. I went back to York, called my employees together, and explained the condition of things. I told them I could start up if I paid them on the basis of a 25% reduction in their wages, but if, at the end of 6 months, the conditions warranted it, and if wages, in general, had not come down, I would pay them the difference. I asked them to think over the proposal and let me know. They did not want to stop work. Some of them had voted at once to accept. Others said that within 6 months, things would be as good as ever. One single man in the factory declined to accept the terms. He left, and after several weeks, he came back, saying he could find no work anywhere and would go to work at half price. But I took him back, of course, on those same terms as the rest. Labor side settled, I went over after raw materials. I wrote to dealers, asking if they would sell me the goods payable, 1/2 cash, or its equivalent, notes with interest, the balance payable at the end of 6 months. Some of them asked if I took them for damn fools. But enough of the dealers accepted my offer. I had no self-pity. It's a recreation that I've always denied to myself, but I might have indulged myself in a little, for in 1876 when, after days and nights of unending labor, I was fairly on my feet, my factory and all I owned were one Sunday completely wiped out by fire. I found myself once more to the point from which I had started years before. As soon as I found that nothing could be done to save the plant, I got the telegraph office to open and sent messages to most of the various houses which I depended on for supplies, telling them I had been burned out, but would shortly start up again and wish to buy materials, which I would want at cash prices to be settled by notes with interest. Extensions and credits were not easy to get. There was general distrust. Some of the dealers wired in reply they would continue to sell me at cash rates, taking my notes with interest for the old account, and generally promised to do everything they could. Fortunately, my credit was of the highest. So, he tells the story of how his factory's burned. He ends up buying another person's factory and operating that. The Depression, according to Farquhar, will actually, and he blames it on the not using the gold standard. That could be controversial, but it will go till 1879, so you really have a large recession there, which is going to affect politics too. It's going to make it difficult for President Grant, for Republicans in general. They'll lose the House and Senate eventually. They will win the presidency, but just barely in 76 and 1880. And I think with that, it's a good time to go back to our folks in Youngstown, Ohio. One thing was clear about what was going on in the late 70s. It wasn't just a slowdown. They weren't going to turn this furnace back on. As, to quote the Bruce Springsteen song, "Hometown, my hometown," these jobs were going and they weren't coming back. And not everyone take these things sitting down. But in a free market economy based on capitalism, there isn't much recourse, right? It's the company's decision to close the plant. Well, people challenged that. The workers in the Youngstown plant that we talked about earlier in the episode, even after their petition is not taken seriously, the initial petition by Carter, they continue. They do not let up. And there is constant pressure on public officials. There are lawsuits and there are proposals. The lawsuit specifically is aimed at the owners of Youngstown Sheet and Tube. And Stoughton Lind and other labor activists are behind this lawsuit. It's not futile because one of the things they find out in discovery is they're actually able to get some hard numbers. And first of all, they find that it was something of a split-second decision to go with Youngstown Sheet and Tube and decide to close that location. It wasn't a guaranteed thing. Secondly, they find out in one of the depositions that, a vice president of the company they actually had plans that they could have modernized. And the third thing that they can pretty much establish from the lawsuit is that while the plant was not making money, it was not a horrible loss that was described in the press, but rather a small loss that perhaps with some innovations, better efficiencies, maybe even bringing the workers in and saying, what can we do differently? That could have been cured, and there was never an opportunity to do that. This all comes out of the lawsuit, and it's an interesting thing because we think about capitalism and private enterprises like, well, you should leave them alone, let them make the decisions. The business people know what they're doing. But in this case, a labor activist was actually able to look at the numbers and point things out and say, well, was it a good business decision? Maybe you're not being aggressive enough. You didn't want to compete and change and take the chance that if you change your furnaces, you can compete with the Germans and the Japanese. Interesting things that come out of it. And then, of course, the more significant proposal that comes out of the coalition between labor activists and the clergy and residents of Youngstown is a proposal to buy the plant. What is called the Industrial Selma, an idea of recreating the Youngstown plant but owned by workers working for themselves. The steel lobby is against it, so the industry associations are against it. The other companies like U.S. Steel are against it. So they do approach the Carter administration. What would have been, it really comes down to, there was a way to make it work. What it comes down to, they would need guarantees on the loans. There's a bit of a process over the years between 77 and 79, and some people feel that the administration waited until after the 78 midterms. The trouble comes down to that the Economic Development Authority, part of the Commerce Department, has a limit of $100 million. Now, that's not something that the Carter administration just came up with. That is policy. And it's looking like the costs and the loan guarantees that they're going to need is about $300 million. 295 is the final number. Here's what Robert Hall, the Assistant Secretary of Commerce and Economic Development, said that the $295 million loan guarantee sought by the group exceeded the Economic Development Administration's limit, and that the EDA had strong reservations about the economic viability of the project. The group believed that they had met the test for market viability with a study that they conducted showing there would be sufficient demand for steel from the plant, and it could turn a profit within 3 years. From the side of Bishop Malone, who's leading the ecumenical coalition, and he's a Catholic priest, $300 million is not outlandish. It's big, but it's a figure that's within the capability of the federal government. You got to remember, Carter's later going to bail out Chrysler. That's $1.5 billion spent on that. They also showed that agreements that the steelworkers themselves would make about their own pay would cut the cost of producing a ton of steel by $12. And they'd just gotten the national union support. It's a big blow. That really is the end. When they can't get the loan guarantees, they cannot proceed. Youngstown does not reopen. Another plant, U.S. Steel, McDonald plant, will essentially close. I believe there's maybe a couple dozen employees there still making small parts and things. That's it. You have in the Mahoning Valley an interesting situation where this was Walter Mondale's one of his best counties running against Reagan in the lopsided election of 1984. Mahoning County votes for Mondale. Mahoning County will consistently vote Democrats, even up to the 2016 election. It's in 2020 when Mahoning flips for Donald Trump. So you see the politics change. While Lind and the steelworkers weren't successful in Youngstown, in other places there have been cooperatives. In other places there have been employee buybacks. In the 80s, Eric Mann is able to keep a plant open, a General Motors plant open in Van Nuys. He gets together coalitions of different racial groups, and they are able to threaten boycotts against General Motors. We are not playing. You close this plant. You put these workers out of work, and we're going to initiate boycotts that you don't want. They are able to get GM to keep the plant open for a time. It does close in 1992. They also immediately began going for state legislation in Ohio, for federal legislation in the United States to establish at least some basic minimum benefits for workers where a large plant is closing. And it finally passes in 1988, the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act. It's a labor law that protects employees, their families, and communities. Requires most employers with 100 or more employees to provide notification 60 calendar days in advance of planned closings and mass layoffs. Notice has to also be given to the unions of these employees. Also to the chief elected official, usually the mayor of the area that the plant is in, and to the state dislocated worker unit. This way everybody's on board and at least can start to prepare for this large company closing. Gives workers time to perhaps set up some training, get other employment. The behavior that was conducted in 77 would be illegal under warrant today because they failed to notice the union. In fact, they, in some ways, deceived the union. The union kind of got the sense something was going on, but they called them in and said everything's going to be all right. And that's just a month before they close. And you can't tell workers when they arrive for a shift, that's it, go home. We're done. We're shutting the furnace down. They have to give 60 days notice now. So the WARN Act is not signed by Ronald Reagan. It requires Democratic-controlled Congress with enough Republicans voting along and enough people absent to get a 66% supermajority because President Reagan does not sign. Other states are more generous in a sense, like California, for instance, 50 or more employees. Connecticut requires employers to maintain health insurance for a certain period of time. Stoughton Lind is an activist. He'd probably be identified, as we said, with the left. But on this issue of rust, resisting rust, you're going to see it go all kinds of different ways. This trend that we have now of a GOP president protecting jobs through tariffs, I mean, it's not totally out of the question. See, in 2003, George W. Bush temporarily had steel tariffs, but then rescinded them in order to save manufacturing jobs in West Virginia and other states. Then he rescinded them. You remember in the 2004 election episode, we talked about the dichotomy between Bush in Ohio and Bush in other states, and the possibility, the very real possibility, that could open up an electoral college misfitting, because there was job loss in Ohio and the governor was even mad at Bush, whereas in the rest of the country, Bush had a decent approval rating and jobs were growing, if slowly. We also talked about how in the 1988 episode, going a bit back, that Dukakis had visited a plant in Ohio and that the Ohio Democrats said, if you talk about this job loss, if you talk about us versus them, big corporations moving plants, you'll win. But really what they were saying is you'll win Ohio or the Rust Belt or something there. This issue is going to move all around. So whether Lind voted for somebody like Jimmy Carter, whether he thought Jimmy Carter was good or bad, you know, President Carter has just passed away as I'm recording this episode, and I did a Jimmy Carter ephemera, you know, and we've done a lot of episodes talking about the good and bad of Jimmy Carter, but, you know, there are critiques, particularly on the left, about how he cut progressive-like programs, cut spending generally, cut healthcare, didn't pursue healthcare with vigor. And most notably, those criticisms came from Teddy Kennedy. I had Rick Perlstein, the historian, on the show, and he's proponent of this. He basically says that Carter was a conservative who happened to be a Democrat. And so, in this case, I don't know how Lind feels about Carter. Lind had passed away a few years ago. But in the Youngstown sheet and tube case, he felt that Carter sided with his new Atlanta bankers over workers when push came to shove. That $100 million could have been found, he thought, if it was even needed, because it was a loan guarantee. The plant was going to produce steel. Steel was still needed. They were going to modernize the plant. Lind writes in his Resisting Plant Shutdowns in the Labor History Journal in the 1980s, it's often said that plants like Wisconsin Steel and U.S. Steel Southworks are closed when they become unprofitable. This term is in precise. Plants tend to be closed by capitalist corporations when the rate of profit returned is less than it could be earned if the same investment capital were used in a different way. He talks about how in the 1980s, Japanese steel companies could operate at 1.7% and be accepted in Japan, especially given the competition with America. So 1.7 profit margin is good enough because we know you're doing something for the country. You're growing world market share. You're improving a situation that doesn't exist right now. But in America, those same steel plants, if they had a 6.7% profit margin, or the whole company had a 6.7% profit margin, Wall Street was saying, no, manufacturing business, at least in the 80s, should be 12%. So you've got to do something. And with the amount of steel being imported, this is where tariffs do become a factor, the imports do become a factor, there was no way those companies could get much more than that 6% without doing drastic things. This is why plants are closed. The employees could reasonably, unions could reasonably, even labor activists can reasonably think in terms of profit margins. It's not impossible. They're not looking to produce non-profit cooperatives. Those things do exist. They do exist, but in a lot of cases, the blue-collar or working class of America, whatever the image might be, were working for companies that they knew and wanted to make a profit margin. It's just how much, right? And when Youngstown Sheet and Tube comes, it has all the hallmarks of an ambush. The workers didn't have time to react in an effective manner, had to use the new playbook, but still they got all the way to the White House till they got their answer. And in fact, after Stoughton Lynn sued, he found out, as we discussed, that the workers who thought that Youngstown Sheet and Tube were going to be open forever may not have been that wrong, because the Legs Corporation, which had bought the Campbell Works there, initially intended just to close the facilities owned by Youngstown Sheet and Tube, which was in northern Indiana, and keep the Ohio plant, the larger plant, open. They had hired just days before a financial analyst to look at their company, and that analyst, not the executives who had been running steel companies for a long time, not even the local manager, who had submitted to Youngstown Steel Corporation an improvement plan so that they could compete with the Europeans and Japanese. It turns out the CEO never saw that plan. Financial analyst comes in, looks at numbers, and decides to close the Ohio plant some days before the announcement is made. So even they didn't know. A crane operator told Lynn that cranes weren't being repaired, and if that wasn't happening, that's a good sign. And now, so this is something that workers will look out for afterwards in plants, like, are they repairing the equipment? In fact, Stoughton Lynn advises workers, don't let the factory rust. Don't let the equipment rust. Don't let them take the equipment away if you can. Protect machinery by leaving it in place and preventing rust and physical deterioration. Even in the case of a Dorothy 6-blast furnace, members of the local union voluntarily winterized the plant without pay to preserve its productive capacity for a future date. They actually set up a 24-hour watch to be sure the equipment wasn't going to be taken away. Once the equipment's taken away, you don't have leverage. So when a tractor trailer pulls up to the gas station to fill up in diesel, realizes it's going to be a while, goes in, driver, and gets himself a beef brisket sandwich and a cola. He knows it will be good because he looks up and there's the sign that says Huck's. Huck's Food and Fuel. One of 125 stores like it, convenience stores, in Tennessee and Indiana, Illinois. What you may not know is that the reason it's so successful, they say, is that the people serving him are also the owners of the company at Huck's. Martin & Bailey, the company that owned Huck's, has been owned by its employees since 2001. It was originally opened in 1974 in Grayville, Illinois, but the family generations later didn't want to continue the business, so they sold it to 2,500 people. It's not just Huck's. Hy-Vee grocery stores, 19,000 employees, 258 stores across the nation, employee-owned. W.L. Gore makes weather-resistant clothing, employee-owned. The Milwaukee Journal, Publix supermarkets. Helped by legislation in 1974 that made employee ownership stock plans beneficial, where contributions to employees for stock purposes are tax deductible from corporate profits. 8 million people today have employee stock in companies with special plans, but it's not really what we're discussing. We're discussing that next step, where that employee stock ownership passes the 50% level. In most companies where there's ESOPs, employee plans, it's 10, 15%. It's a benefit. It's a fringe benefit and a tax benefit to the companies that decide to do it. It's done with good intentions. It's a good thing for companies to do. More should do it. But we're talking about something more radical where it reaches beyond 50% and the employees are the managers. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of companies like that, and some of them are big. You might say, oh, you mean like a co-op where everybody has long hair and they all do work and then they all vote who's the best employee and they're all Democrat. No, that thing does exist, definitely, and it's a category of what we're talking about. And some of them are not all long hair. We have like absolute workplace democracies. Some of those do certainly exist. You've got a great one in Cleveland, the Cleveland Trust, that has an absolute co-op system, which has a laundry business that services nursing homes in Cleveland. You have a solar power business. You have a green growers, gardening company, and all of them are controlled by the workers. And so you take the laundry business in Cleveland there, the Evergreen Cooperative Laundry. So a worker will make, say, $10.50 an hour. $10 goes to the employee, and 50 cents goes towards their purchase of stock in the company. The longer they work there, the more stock that they'll have. In addition to that, they're also invited to be part of meetings and the like. There's 50 employees in that company. Now, it's not just small companies. You take B&A, a top market research firm for, what's going on in Washington if you want to kind of find out. From the 40s till 2011, this firm was owned by its employees. It's now owned by Bloomberg. But when that sale was made, and sometimes employee companies very often do become no longer employee companies. It's not a permanent thing all the time. But when they do make a sale like that, those employees get paid because they're owners of the company. Graybar's another one. 8,200 employees in electrical communications, data networking, based in St. Louis. It's been owned by employees since 1929. Graybar has a little bit different structure than other companies in that the employees get shares at $20. Okay? If they sell them before they retire, the price is $20. They're not making any money on their stock. If they keep it to retirement, they get market value. See? The $20 is a lot less than what Graybar stock is. I didn't look it up what the current amount is, but it's interesting. At the same time, they're also getting dividends on the stock. So Graybar employees are well compensated. And, you might ask, what is this, some kind of socialist solution? Well, it's not, because somebody owned this company to begin with. A few of them are started as employee-only companies. But generally, they're companies that are already existing. And the owner wants to sell. There isn't always a buyer. So it benefits the owners too. It benefits people looking to liquidate their businesses and do something else. Who's most interested? Well, one group would be those employees. And you see, for instance, some consultants on the internet suggesting that business owners who are having trouble selling their business consider this option. This is where you have the kind of strange example of Weirton Steel. Weirton Steel. Weirton Steel. Weirton Steel. Wyerton Steel, West Virginia. This company was facing hard times and did several employee buyouts, but they never reached 50%. So they did several things like, hey, can we'll sell some stock to you when they needed cash. They were still laying workers off. So this was one employee-owned company that Stoughton Lind, for instance, actually said this isn't a great deal necessarily for workers. The workers have no democracy. They're not invited on committees. Studies show that workers that are more participating in the employee company, that it's not just some abstract management, do better. Weirton did the company did some employee buyouts, eventually files for bankruptcy in 2003. The workers had taken a pay cut. Many of them were laid off. Never quite stopped the bleeding. It was bought by Wilbur Ross in 2005, who later became Commerce Secretary under Trump. Some people were happy that he bought the plant, but the firm had already laid off workers, already given its pension obligations away to the federal government, saying we can't pay it, and already ended payment of health benefits to retirees, life insurance to retirees that were owned. So Wilbur Ross was buying the leftover parts from 13,000 jobs to 8,800 jobs. Bush's brief experiment with tariffs didn't help the steel company. Trump's tariffs, 25% steel tariff during his presidency might have helped a little bit. But the trouble is so many other manufacturing companies use steel that the increased cost of steel, there's some studies that show you lost more jobs in manufacturing because of that. So that's something to consider. But in any case, Weirton Steel is now officially closed. So even the 900 or so employees that were there finishing steel and making tin, plating, and things like that are now gone. A lot of the actions that you take, it's kind of like WARN or a brief employee ownership. Some of these actions that you take are going to be just temporary. But there have been studies of companies that are owned by a majority of employee stock plan owners, and most show that there's a positive influence on corporate performance. The more worker participation, the more you have, say, committees. In some cases, you have required participation on the part of the employee. You got to sit in on some management meetings. You have to advise management. What's going wrong in the process? Things like that. What can be improved? The better they do. Nothing's guaranteed. For instance, in my research for this episode, when I was looking at the Huck's website, because, I'm not somebody who's visited Huck's Fuel and Food, maybe I will someday, I noticed some comments from Huck's own truck drivers who said, this company looks out for other truck drivers, but not its own. So even an employee-owned company doesn't mean all the workers are happy. Who's better at business, the workers or the capitalists, right? Well, a few stories on this, There's a certain type of capitalism, a financial capitalism that the capitalists are much better at. And Billy Durnat, the head of General Motors from the 1920s, instilled in that company, and it's still in the modern GM, that each division be organized on a profit-making basis, based on return on investment. Not just profit of the enterprise, or how much money it makes and clears after that year's cost, but how much money was put into it. So a 20% net return on all investment capital had to be made. If a division boasted $10 million in profits, say, but $100 million had been invested, that return is too low for General Motors. And they might well close that division and say, even though we're putting $10 million in our pocket, we don't want it. If there's some place better to put the money, and that could even be, that better place could be another company. or it could be the stock market. You see, each new project would not only have to pay its own way and clear some, but it would have to compete with other uses for that capital. This is the rust creator, if you ask me. This is the thing that's causing some now bipartisan angst that makes Democratic candidates in the 80s unhappy, and a Republican president now unhappy, and some Republican congressional candidates unhappy. That's what it is. It's net return on investment, as opposed to profit of the enterprise, which workers can reasonably understand. The market can't be trusted to make the right long-term decisions always, especially if you want to say that there's something we have value. For instance, in saying there's a national security value to having a steel industry. Or if you want to make the case, and I'm not advocating for it because I'm not completely sold while I'm doing this episode on whether service or manufacturing is better, whether you can be a big Switzerland, say, and make most of your money on service, which is actually Switzerland has a long history of chemicals and other industries, but put that aside. A lot of their industry now is service. Can you maintain it? Do you need manufacturing? Do you need to make something? And can that something be metal or plastic or digital? I'm philosophical about that, but I can somewhat afford to be, I guess, would be the argument, right? But if you feel, as it appears a significant group of GOP do now, that manufacturing is something special and must be preserved, that there's a communal interest perhaps in it, they probably wouldn't like that term. There's an American interest in it, a patriotic interest in it. You can't just turn it over to free market. In South Chicago, former workers from both Wisconsin Steel and U.S. Steel called on the federal government to use some of the levers it had and said, you do have levers. This is not a decision that you just need to let happen, a plant closing. You can repeal write-offs you're giving these companies if they close a plant. Tax write-offs don't come to companies that close plants. You can rebuild infrastructure. The other countries are. Japan was. West Germany at the time was. If part of the problem is the train's too slow, help us build that train. Initially, in the case of Wisconsin Steel and U.S. Steel, they had support from the city of Chicago, which was talking about suing over eminent domain. It's tough, though. That's a tough hammer to wield. It sounds like, right? Why don't you get the workers to have their town just eminent domain these plant properties? Threaten the company with that. We're gonna actually take it from you. Now, the trouble is you got to give them fair market value. And fair market value of a steel plant, say, a lot of cities are, a city might be able to buy out a piece of real estate, but a plant, too difficult. But Lind also noted that in the case of Wisconsin Steel, 1,000 workers that were being laid off, and only about 250 were coming to their rallies. And that's just not going to work. Chicago saw that and lost interest in joining the fight. They got off the lawsuit. In Pittsburgh, there was an effective boycott or threat to boycott certain banks or financial institutions that the closure depended on. The withdrawal of hundreds of thousands of dollars from Mellon Bank forced Mesta Machine to reverse course and give some 1,200 workers their pensions and severance pay. Passing out thousands of pledge cards to withdraw monies from Equibank forced the Nabisco Company to reverse course and stay open in its factory for another 16 years. One more Hail Mary that was attempted in the Youngstown case was to create a Steel Valley Authority, just like the Tennessee Valley Authority. Now you're talking that this federal authority, much like the WPA, would have the power to acquire by eminent domain these properties that were abandoned by profit. It's not socialism, Lind. Of course, it's going to get called socialism, but hear him out here. It's not socialism. But you, as a profit-making enterprise, just told the world you can't make profit here. Then let's test that. And our steel-making authority will try. Butland said the banks and big corporations of Pittsburgh badmouthed the proposal. And we made the mistake of letting the United Steelworkers of America National Union pick who would do the feasibility study. When they picked a New York investment house called Lazard Perez, they said the proposal wasn't possible. And that was that. Other feasibilities had concluded the reverse, even naming customers. So even though close to a dozen municipalities, including Pittsburgh, had joined with Youngstown to suggest this steel authority, it never happened. Is Lynn's ideas crazy? Is he just some kind of radical? Well, like I said, we're coming in a real weird place, right? Where the radical issues of a guy that someone might say, go send out a guard and beat him, commie, something like that, is now ostensibly bipartisan. So a lot of politics, a lot of words, talk of tariffs and things like this. Here's the deal. In the year 1989, you had 20,690,000 Americans employed in private sector manufacturing. That just goes straight down to 13,400,000 in 2009. Your jump up, such that it is, because that's more reflective, right? We had an economic crash in 2009 and every sector was affected. Your jump up occurs almost immediately. It jumps up to 13.5. By 2013, we're at 14.1, 14,188,000. And you get a little blip in 2019, 15,065,000 private sector manufacturing jobs. Drops in 2020 to 13,884,000. And in 2023 sits at 14,922,000 manufacturing jobs. Let's just analyze that. What can, say, policies of Trump? Say, look at President Trump. In the election year, it's 14,777,000. You go to about the same in 2017, 14,656,000. Ticks up to 14,855,000, but not a lot. And then up to 15 million, but drops in 2020 to 13,884,000. Could be COVID related, tariff related, both. The demand's going to drop. In 2021, 14 million, and then, as I said, in 2023, 14,922,000. So, look, it depends on how you play with the statistics. All right, in those numbers I just gave you. It's hard, like you're not looking at a chart. I could make a little rhetorical example that, hey, Trump's policies work because, look, he juked the numbers from 2017 to 2019. Or I could equally say, boy, look at Biden. He was a manufacturing jobs machine in his time. And it all depends on where you start the clock and where you go to. But the reality is, we're at 14 million, maybe 15 million jobs in manufacturing. We're not even where we were in 2008. And forget about where you were at 18 million in 2001. Or where you were in 1985 at 20 million. We're not moving the needle significantly, as they say. It's a couple 100,000 here, couple 100,000 there. And very much related to other economic factors that don't seem related to a president and policies. Years ago, I had a podcast called The Steelworker and Bob Seger. Now, maybe so many years have passed. This was 2013 when I did that episode. I have to explain who Bob Seger is. Obviously he's a rock and roll star that would be listened to by Michigan auto workers, And, but yet what Bob Seger does is a service product. He produces, in a sense, and now it would be considered a digital product. His voice singing a song, his guitar playing music. And what's more important, that product or the steel product, right? What's the difference is really the thing to say. Why does it feel better to work in one than the other? And I really have a philosophical argument that I still to this day haven't resolved. Here's a bit of that episode.
Let's look at it a bit, and we'll go back to history. And Alexander Hamilton, of course, thought that manufacturing was the basis of a new economy for America. He recommended tariffs to protect American industries, subsidies funded by those tariffs to help manufacturing, to give grants to people who would have to build the giant industrial machines we would need. He issued a report on manufacturers, which said the U.S. was in shabby shape in 1791 in terms of its industry. He himself, along with others, helped to fund an industrial area in New Jersey. But all of this talk is when we were building up from an agricultural economy. This is when the nation was in its infancy, relied on imported goods, providing very little services, when the rich countries of the world were the ones with the ironworks. And if all you did was raise corn and pigs, you'd be sending your coin over to the country that made stuff. In 1791, that would have been Great Britain and a little bit France. Now, in modern times, things are different from when Alexander Hamilton issued his report. So compare and contrast. Great Britain is one of many countries in modern times that is rich from not making stuff. Countries that are rich now make stuff, but they service stuff more. The World Bank shows, for instance, that high-income countries are on average 66% service, only 32% industrial, manufacturing. Low-income countries are 35% service and 38% industrial. They make stuff, but their countries are not the seat of empires. The U.S. has transformed, according to the Bureau of Economic Analysis. When Harry Truman was president, U.S. manufacturing was 26% of GDP, and now it's somewhere near 15%. And the estimates of this percentage vary a bit, but the estimates of the drop do not. But here's the thing. Where is, as in your question, the story of that country that went all services and then went bankrupt and suffered? I haven't seen it. In our own case, despite that manufacturing decline I talked about from Harry Truman's time to our time, we didn't have a decline in GDP, but an increase, $244 billion to $14 trillion now. I know, population's changed, inflation's changed, right. But what about per capita GDP? It's up from 9,561 to 41,000 real dollars, 2009 dollars. Future of America with the steel worker or with Bob Seger, the singer that sings about the steel worker and the steel worker's life, you know. Yes, obviously there can only be one Bob Seger, so that's not really a good representation of the service economy. But what about the people that sing for the product? And that would be the salespeople, right, who are out there promoting, marketing people who do the accounting for the company, people who go out and try to get investors for that plant. So, you know, which one do we look at? I suspect we are viewing services as less valuable than they are, as low-paying, and as something that only our own countrymen and women would be interested in as opposed to making products. That makes sense if we speak of waiters or retail salespeople, right? We're just selling stuff to ourselves, bringing us pie and coffee. But when you start talking about an e-commerce web designer, you know, someone who can program an API, a doctor who can get on an online visualization and make commentary, a copyright lawyer, a financier, and all the service that might go with these professions, a business startup consultant, a writer, a mobile app programmer. Our ability to define jobs hurts in answering this question. Our ability to define services is difficult too. Cell phones, computers, these are products made, but the factory part of those products is not the most interesting part, I would suspect. It's the service that comes around it. They're products wrapped in service. I think service jobs get complicated in so much that you can't even think about them if you're a government planner or us talking on this podcast. You know, it's something that entrepreneurs create, the market for goods and services create, because companies decide what function they need. Maybe a guy that designs Excel spreadsheets all day. That may be what's needed, at least in the time. So I think it's just something that's hard to define. You know, people don't go to school to be a project manager or a salesperson, but in many cases, that's where the jobs are.
And I still can't say that I've resolved things on this front. It does seem, though, that at least in various areas, there is trouble, and it's something, this question has been present all my life. I mean, my father was somebody who certainly would say, we don't make anything here anymore, and that's the problem. And there's a better standard of living when you're actually making something. But I haven't seen it myself in either aggregate numbers or in my own experience. Either way, right? And I believe it's very much dependent on what part of the country you live. And contrary to some opinions, it's not just a small little group that works in service. It's all over the country in many different parts. And they're very well-populated areas. And to grow jobs in an economy, it's going to be important to improve that too. So opening a few plants won't change that overall if we're losing on the other end. So, hey, listen, I mean, this will mark the end of the Ark of Commerce, the reintroduction of the Ark of Commerce. This is a completely original episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed the whole series. Will you support me on Patreon if you can? Will you write a review of the program if you can? If you've listened and you've gotten this far, please write a review. I need it on Apple would be the best, Apple Podcasts, but I could use it anywhere. And, subscribe to the podcast. Do what you can. If you can afford to, support on the Patreon. If you can't, I mean, look, this episode topic doesn't give me a great desire to go out and ask for your money, because there are some hard times in different places. And just by listening, you're helping me out. But if you can, and join the Patreon, get more content. I want to thank you for listening.
Are you earning and investing in the stock market, in real estate? How about in relationships? Are you earning and investing in your life? I'm Doc G, semi-retired hospice physician and host of the Earn and Invest podcast, where we have the 201 or next level conversations about money and life. Not only how you make money and grow it, but also how you use your wealth to create a better and more fulfilling existence. Join us every Monday and Thursday wherever you listen to fine podcasts.